Imagine stepping out of chains into a world that promises freedom, yet offers no map to navigate it. In 1865, after the brutal years of the American Civil War, millions of enslaved African Americans were legally freed. The Emancipation Proclamation had paved the way, and the 13th Amendment sealed their legal liberation. On paper, they were no longer property. They were citizens, capable of making choices about their lives, families, and futures. But freedom, as many soon discovered, was just the beginning of a much longer, more complex journey. For centuries, African Americans had been denied not only their liberty, but also the most basic opportunities to learn, own property, or shape their own destiny. Suddenly, emancipation threw them into a society that still held deep prejudices, where laws and customs were designed to keep them at the margins. Being free did not mean they were safe, respected, or equal. The promise of freedom came hand in hand with new challenges: finding work, securing land, educating their children, and navigating a world where hostility and discrimination lurked at every corner. Many formerly enslaved people sought to reunite families torn apart by slavery, a heartbreaking task that took persistence and hope. Others aimed to build lives that were once unimaginable, owning a home, learning to read and write, and participating in community and civic life. Freedmen's schools, churches, and community organizations sprang up, serving as beacons of resilience and hope. These institutions were not just centers of learning and worship, they were lifelines, offering guidance, protection, and a sense of identity in a society that often sought to deny it. Yet, the road was treacherous. Southern states enacted restrictive black codes, limiting movement, labor choices, and legal rights, effectively trying to reimpose a shadow of slavery. Violence and intimidation, carried out by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, reminded freed African Americans that freedom was fragile and that equality was far from guaranteed. Despite these obstacles, African Americans forged ahead, determined to claim the rights and dignity that had been denied to them for generations. This story of legal freedom but not yet true equality is more than history. It is a lesson in resilience, courage, and the enduring human spirit. As we explore the journey of African Americans after emancipation, we witness a community refusing to be defined by oppression, building lives of dignity against the odds, and laying the foundations for future generations to claim the promise of equality. If you find this story inspiring and want to learn more about the struggles and triumphs that shaped history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Join us as we uncover the journeys, the hardships, and the victories that continue to echo through time. Thank you for watching, and let us honor the courage and resilience of those who fought for freedom. As the sun rose over the plantations of the South in the years following the Civil War, a new reality unfolded for the millions of African Americans who had been granted legal freedom. On paper, they were no longer enslaved. The chains that had bound their bodies and spirits for generations had been struck down by the 13th Amendment. Yet, as they stepped into this uncertain world, a shadow loomed over their newfound liberty. The Southern states, deeply scarred by the loss of the war and unwilling to relinquish control over the lives of black people, began enacting laws that would define and restrict the movement and rights of the very individuals who had been emancipated. These black codes, as they came to be known, were carefully crafted to preserve a social order that mirrored the old world of slavery, even as it masqueraded under the guise of legality. For the freedmen and women, these laws were an immediate and chilling reality. They restricted where people could live, what jobs they could hold, and the contracts they could sign, effectively controlling every aspect of daily life. In towns and rural communities alike, local authorities enforced curfews, required passes for travel, and imposed fines for what were often minor or fabricated infractions. The codes targeted vagrancy and unemployment, branding those who were unable to find work or leave their place of residence as criminals. In essence, freedom had become conditional, a fragile privilege that depended on constant adherence to rules designed to keep black people in a state of subjugation. Families who sought to reunite after years of forced separation found themselves facing bureaucratic hurdles and social hostility, their desire to live together often impeded by laws that prioritized control over compassion. Yet the human spirit proved resilient. Despite the suffocating presence of these laws, African Americans began to carve out spaces of autonomy and community within the confines imposed upon them. Churches, once clandestine havens of faith during slavery, became centers for organizing, education, and mutual support. Freedmen's schools spread across the South, offering literacy and practical skills to children and adults who had been denied the most basic education for generations. Within these institutions, a new generation learned not only to read and write, but also to understand their rights, their history, and the possibilities that lay before them. Even in a society that sought to diminish their humanity, the Black Codes did more than limit economic and social mobility. They sent a stark message that African Americans were not yet welcomed as equals. Land ownership, a path to economic independence and security, was systematically obstructed through legal loopholes and social intimidation, forcing many into arrangements such as sharecropping, which often mirrored the exploitative dynamics of slavery itself. Even as freedmen labored tirelessly to build homes, farms, and businesses, they encountered obstacles designed to maintain a rigid racial hierarchy, where their labor was expected, but their progress was constrained. Towns and counties, often under the control of local white authorities who viewed the presence of empowered black citizens with suspicion, implemented ordinances that further curtailed freedom, reinforcing a system where opportunity was limited and surveillance was constant. Despite these barriers, moments of triumph emerged. In the Reconstruction era, African Americans began to participate in political life, voting and even holding office in local and state governments. These achievements, however, were met with fierce resistance. White supremacist groups, emboldened by resentment and fear, used intimidation, violence, and terror to undermine the political agency of black communities. Churches and schools, while serving as sanctuaries, were not immune from attack. The legal system, meanwhile, often turned a blind eye to injustices, leaving African Americans to navigate both codified discrimination and the unrelenting threat of extralegal retribution. Every small victory required immense courage, careful strategy, and unwavering community solidarity, as each step forward could be met with immediate backlash. In the midst of such adversity, the story of African Americans in the post-emancipation South becomes a narrative of perseverance and ingenuity. Families who were legally free yet socially constrained found ways to maintain dignity, pass down culture, and cultivate hope. They organized mutual aid societies, built schools from the ground up, and created networks that could provide protection and support in times of need. Even when land was scarce and legal rights were restricted, they pursued economic opportunities wherever possible, whether through tenant farming, skilled trades, or small businesses. Through every challenge imposed by restrictive laws and societal hostility, they demonstrated that freedom, though contested, could be claimed in spirit and practice, and that resilience could flourish even in a world structured to limit it. The Black Codes of the South, designed to maintain control over a population that had been legally emancipated, ultimately reveal the complexities of freedom itself. Legal liberation was only the first step. The real work lay in asserting one's humanity in a society that was still struggling to accept it. African Americans, facing laws that constrained movement, employment, and political participation, responded with creativity, courage, and unbreakable community bonds, laying the foundation for future generations to continue the pursuit of equality and justice. In telling this story, we honor not only the struggle against oppressive laws, but also the determination, ingenuity, and hope that transformed a legal promise of freedom into a lived reality, even amidst relentless adversity. After the Civil War, the legal freedom granted to African Americans marked a monumental shift in American history. Yet the promise of liberty was immediately tempered by harsh economic realities. For many newly emancipated people, the path to independence was obstructed by a combination of limited resources, entrenched social hierarchies, and systemic legal restrictions that sought to maintain control over their lives. While the chains of slavery were broken, the structures of economic exploitation endured in more subtle forms, often manifesting through the widespread practice of tenant farming and sharecropping. In the fields and towns of the post-war South, former slaves were confronted with a daunting paradox. They were free by law but trapped in circumstances that replicated many of the hardships they had endured under slavery. Tenant farming became a common route for survival. Freed individuals were given or leased small plots of land by white landowners in exchange for a portion of the crops they produced. On the surface, this system appeared to offer autonomy and a means to earn a living, but the reality was far more constricting. The agreements were frequently structured to favor the landowners, leaving the laborers dependent on credit for seed, tools, and basic necessities, which was often provided at exorbitant interest rates. A single bad season, poor harvest, or unexpected expense could plunge families into debt, making it nearly impossible to escape the cycle of dependency. What had been intended as a path to self-sufficiency often became a chain as binding in its own way as the shackles of slavery, perpetuating economic instability and limiting upward mobility. Life under these arrangements required constant negotiation between survival and aspiration. Families worked sunrise to sunset, laboring on plots they did not own, yet striving to cultivate enough crops to feed themselves and meet the demands of the landowner. Even as they planted, harvested, and transported produce, they faced the uncertainty of financial records often manipulated to reflect greater debts than actually existed. The more they worked, the more indebted they became. A cycle carefully maintained to ensure a steady labor force while simultaneously limiting the possibility of independence. Despite the grueling labor, these communities fostered resilience, learning to rely on collective support networks, pooling resources, and sharing knowledge about farming techniques, weather patterns, and financial negotiation. Every small success, an extra bushel of corn, a loan paid off, a plot of land saved represented a hard-won step toward self-determination. Education became a critical tool for navigating these constraints. Freedmen and women recognized that literacy and numeracy could provide leverage in a system designed to keep them subservient. Schools and churches served as centers of learning, offering instruction in reading, writing, and mathematics, as well as guidance in understanding contracts, wages, and agricultural management. Within these spaces, people could begin to envision alternatives to the economic traps that tenant farming and debt had created. Children who learned to read and write not only gained knowledge but also absorbed lessons in agency, resilience, and community solidarity. The struggle for education was inseparable from the struggle for economic independence, with each step forward providing hope for future generations that they might escape the burdens imposed upon their parents. At the same time, the pervasive social structures of the South reinforced economic inequities. White landowners and local authorities exercised immense influence, often using both formal and informal means to maintain a hierarchical society. Social pressures, racial discrimination, and occasional acts of intimidation reinforced the notion that African Americans were expected to labor and remain economically subordinate. In this environment, the aspirations of freed people had to contend not only with financial hardship but also with persistent societal resistance. Community gatherings, mutual aid societies, and church-based organizations became essential mechanisms through which families could assert their dignity, support one another, and find strategies to navigate a world designed to restrict their progress. Despite these challenges, tenant farming communities demonstrated remarkable perseverance. Families maintained a focus on long-term goals, seeking to acquire small plots of land, save for education, or invest in tools and livestock that could incrementally improve their circumstances. Success was often measured not by sudden prosperity, but by incremental steps that allowed a family to sustain itself, educate its children, and retain a sense of autonomy. Cultural traditions. Storytelling and music provided both solace and strength, reinforcing identity and community cohesion amidst the uncertainties of the economic landscape. Every season of planting and harvesting became a testament to endurance, ingenuity, and the unyielding desire to transform legal freedom into tangible, lived liberty. In examining the era of tenant farming and the cycles of debt that ensnared so many African American families, it becomes clear that freedom alone was insufficient to dismantle the deep structures of inequality. The struggle to convert legal emancipation into practical self-determination required intelligence, courage, and the forging of resilient communities capable of sustaining hope and ambition against considerable odds. Families navigated a world in which the promise of independence was constantly challenged by economic exploitation. Systemic discrimination, and the lingering shadows of slavery, yet they persisted, sowing not only crops but also the seeds of agency, dignity, and future possibilities. In their labor, their creativity, and their unwavering commitment to family and community, these freedmen and women laid the groundwork for generations to come, demonstrating that even in circumstances designed to limit them, freedom could be expanded through resilience, solidarity, and vision. In the years immediately following the Civil War, the newly freed African American population faced a world that was legally theirs yet practically hostile. A landscape filled with both opportunity and profound obstacles. The chains of slavery had been broken, but the structures that had enforced their subjugation persisted in subtler forms, leaving millions to navigate an environment rife with uncertainty, prejudice, and economic limitation. Into this space stepped the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal initiative designed to provide practical support to those who had been enslaved, offering education, healthcare, and legal guidance in a society that often sought to deny them these basic rights. This agency became a lifeline, not only in practical terms but also symbolically, signaling a commitment to the notion that freedom entailed more than the absence of physical chains. It required the tools and knowledge to live autonomously and with dignity. Education emerged as one of the most transformative offerings of the Freedmen's Bureau, addressing centuries of systemic deprivation that had kept African Americans illiterate and disconnected from the knowledge necessary to navigate a modernizing nation. Schools sprang up across the South, staffed by Northern teachers, missionaries, and local volunteers who braved the hostility of communities resistant to black advancement. In these classrooms, children and adults alike discovered the power of literacy, learning to read not only for communication but also as a means of empowerment, equipping themselves to understand contracts, navigate legal obligations, and advocate for their families. The act of reading and writing became revolutionary in itself, a quiet defiance against a system that had long sought to suppress their voices, and an essential foundation for economic self-sufficiency in the face of exploitative labor arrangements like sharecropping and tenant farming. Parents who had once been denied education labored alongside their children to absorb every lesson, understanding that literacy was a bridge from the oppression of the past to the promise of a more autonomous future. Healthcare, another crucial component of the Freedmen's Bureau's mission, addressed the immediate physical needs of a population emerging from the brutalities of slavery and war. Malnutrition, disease, and the lingering scars of forced labor left many African Americans in fragile health, and access to medical care was limited by both geography and discrimination. Bureau physicians and nurses worked to establish clinics and mobile services, providing vaccinations, treatment for chronic and acute illnesses, and guidance in sanitation and nutrition. These services were not simply about treating disease. They offered the reassurance of care in a society that had long regarded Black lives as expendable. For families who had endured decades of neglect and physical exploitation, the presence of trained medical professionals who were invested in their well-being signaled a profound shift, one that validated their humanity and their right to survive and thrive. Legal support, often intertwined with education and healthcare, became another vital avenue through which the Freedmen's Bureau sought to protect the newly freed. African Americans faced a barrage of legal challenges, from disputes over land and wages to violations of personal rights under the emerging Black codes. Bureau agents provided assistance in filing claims, understanding contracts, and navigating the judicial system, helping individuals assert their rights in contexts where local authorities were frequently hostile or indifferent. By offering guidance and representation, the Bureau empowered freed people to take steps toward economic independence, family stability, and social recognition, turning legal knowledge into a tool for survival and advancement. The provision of legal support also underscored a broader principle. Freedom was not simply the cessation of bondage, but the capacity to live with agency, protection, and the ability to shape one's own destiny. The impact of these efforts extended far beyond immediate practical assistance. Schools, clinics, and legal aid offices became hubs of community organization and resilience, places where African Americans could gather to share knowledge, strategize for the future, and cultivate a sense of identity and purpose. Teachers and agents of the Bureau often became mentors and advocates, bridging the gap between a federal system and local communities, fostering networks that enabled families to support one another amid adversity. The Bureau's presence encouraged a culture of self-improvement, instilling confidence and ambition in individuals who had been conditioned to believe in their own inferiority. By equipping freed people with education, healthcare, and legal acumen, the Freedmen's Bureau sowed seeds that would grow into institutions, leadership, and social movements capable of challenging the systemic inequities that persisted long after slavery ended, even as the Bureau struggled with limited resources. Bureaucratic constraints, and opposition from local populations. The stories of its impact resonate in the narratives of countless families who were able to claim greater agency over their lives. Children who learned to read and write went on to teach others, creating ripples of literacy and empowerment throughout their communities. Families who accessed medical care were able to rebuild their health and labor capacity, contributing to the economic sustainability of their households. Individuals who received legal guidance found ways to secure land, protect property, and assert rights that might otherwise have been ignored or violated. These outcomes highlight the interconnectedness of education, health, and legal empowerment, demonstrating that freedom without the means to exercise it was incomplete, but that structured support could transform legal liberation into tangible progress. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the Freedmen's Bureau was more than a government program. It was a catalyst for hope, resilience, and self-determination. By providing education, healthcare, and legal support, The Bureau helped African Americans navigate the treacherous terrain of post-emancipation society, bridging the gap between formal freedom and practical opportunity. It stands as a testament to the idea that liberty is most meaningful when accompanied by the resources and knowledge necessary to live fully, safely, and independently, and that the foundation of lasting freedom lies not only in laws and amendments, but also in the empowerment of individuals and communities to claim their rights, pursue their goals, and shape their futures with confidence. In the years following emancipation, as African Americans navigated the uncharted territory of freedom, the landscapes of the South were dotted with new symbols of hope and resilience. Churches rising on cleared plots of land, schoolhouses built from timber and determination, and gathering spaces that pulsed with the energy of communities reclaiming their lives. For generations, Black people had been denied formal education and the ability to organize freely. Yet in the wake of liberation, they seized every opportunity to cultivate knowledge, spirituality, and solidarity. The church, once a clandestine haven for worship during the era of slavery, emerged as more than a place of faith. It became the heartbeat of Black communities, a center for guidance, education, and mutual support that extended far beyond Sunday services. Congregations formed not merely to pray but to strategize, to teach, to protect, and to envision futures that were no longer dictated by oppression. Schoolhouses, too, were erected in towns and rural areas alike, often with little more than volunteer labor and scarce resources. Yet they carried the profound weight of transformation. Children and adults alike flocked to these schools, eager to learn the skills that had been withheld from them for generations, understanding that literacy and numeracy were tools not just for personal advancement but for communal empowerment. In these classrooms, lessons were layered with meaning. Learning to read, write, and calculate became acts of defiance against centuries of enforced ignorance. The same spaces that taught arithmetic also nurtured understanding of civic rights, of history, and of the possibilities that lay ahead, planting seeds of agency in minds that had once been silenced. For families striving to secure a foothold in an economy designed to limit their autonomy, education was both shield and sword, a means of navigating contracts, negotiating fair labor arrangements, and envisioning a future unbound by the cycles of debt that plagued tenant farming and sharecropping. Within these churches and schools, the intertwining of faith and learning created networks of support that were essential for survival in a society still hostile to Black progress. Families relied on one another, pooling resources for teachers, textbooks, and building materials, creating webs of mutual assistance that strengthened the fabric of community life. The clergy often doubled as educators, counselors, and advocates, guiding their congregations through the legal and social challenges imposed by the Black codes and local ordinances designed to restrict movement and employment. In this environment, spiritual life was inseparable from practical life. Sermons reinforced values of perseverance, dignity, and hope, while community meetings and educational sessions provided strategies for survival and advancement. The church, with its combination of ritual, teaching, and communal oversight, became a sanctuary where identity could be affirmed, aspirations nurtured, and collective resilience strengthened. The schools established during this era were not merely formal structures but symbols of possibility, embodying the promise that freedom could be exercised meaningfully when paired with knowledge and critical thinking. Teachers, often from northern states or local Black leaders, faced hostility, scarcity of materials, and the daunting challenge of educating children who had grown up in a system designed to keep them illiterate. Yet the perseverance yielded profound results. Literacy opened doors to political engagement, economic opportunity, and social mobility. equipping generations to challenge inequities and participate in the broader society with confidence. In many, these schools became incubators of leadership, nurturing individuals who would go on to influence local and regional politics. Establish businesses. An advocate for civil rights. Education was both a personal achievement and a communal triumph, a tangible demonstration of agency in a world that had sought to deny it. Churches, meanwhile, extended their influence beyond spiritual guidance and education, functioning as centers for mutual aid, social organizing, and cultural preservation. Meetings held after services allowed communities to plan responses to economic pressures, negotiate labor agreements, and coordinate support for families affected by illness or loss. Music, storytelling, and shared rituals reinforced cultural continuity, offering solace and strength while instilling pride in heritage and identity. The integration of spiritual and practical life created a unique social infrastructure that enabled African Americans to navigate systemic oppression while asserting their humanity and potential. In the absence of equitable government support, these institutions became indispensable. Providing structure, advocacy, and reassurance in a time of uncertainty and transition. The interdependence of churches and schools reflected a broader strategy of community building, one in which education, faith, and mutual assistance were inextricably linked. Families understood that personal advancement required communal support, that the lessons learned in school could be applied to daily life, and that spiritual guidance could fortify resolve against social and economic challenges. Together, these institutions nurtured a sense of purpose, hope, and agency, allowing African Americans to envision a future in which freedom was not merely a legal status, but a lived reality. Over time, these centers became anchors, connecting generations and sustaining the social cohesion necessary for long-term resilience in the face of systemic inequality, violence, and legal restrictions. Through churches and schools, African American communities transformed the promise of emancipation into tangible progress, creating spaces where knowledge, faith, and solidarity intertwined to foster empowerment. The work undertaken within these walls extended far beyond individual benefit, shaping the culture, politics, and social structure of entire communities and laying the foundation for future struggles for equality and justice, in a world that sought to limit their freedom through economic exploitation. Restrictive laws and social intimidation, these institutions became beacons of hope and resilience, demonstrating that true liberation encompassed not only the absence of chains but the presence of opportunity, knowledge, and collective strength. They stand as enduring testaments to the creativity, perseverance, and vision of a people determined to claim the full promise of freedom and to build a society in which dignity and potential could flourish, even in the face of relentless adversity. In the wake of the Civil War, as the Southern states grappled with the dismantling of slavery and the reintegration into a union reshaped by emancipation, African Americans began to take unprecedented steps toward exercising their newfound rights, navigating a landscape both fraught with danger and bursting with potential. The Reconstruction era, a brief but transformative period in American history, offered opportunities for formerly enslaved people to participate directly in the political process, to shape policies that affected their lives, and to claim a voice that had been denied for centuries. For the first time, African Americans were not only voters but also candidates, stepping into public office at local, state, and even federal levels, asserting their presence in spaces from which they had been violently excluded for generations. This engagement was neither symbolic nor superficial. It was an active, sometimes audacious claim to influence, a demonstration of the ambition, intellect, and determination of communities that had long been silenced. The road to political participation was neither smooth nor guaranteed. Black men, having been enfranchised through constitutional amendments and Reconstruction legislation, faced not only the logistical challenges of voting in a system historically designed to exclude them, but also the constant threat of intimidation, violence, and legal manipulation. White supremacist groups, emboldened by resentment and the desire to maintain pro-war social hierarchies, employed tactics ranging from economic coercion to outright terror, attempting to undermine the political agency of African Americans. Despite these threats, Freedmen organized voter registration drives, community meetings, and civic education programs, often within the protective walls of churches and schools that had become central to their communities. These institutions, already serving as hubs for learning and mutual aid, provided spaces where strategies could be developed, ballots could be understood, and collective action could be planned. Participation in elections became a profound act of courage, a tangible assertion of freedom, and a challenge to centuries of systemic oppression. Those who assumed public office during Reconstruction faced extraordinary responsibilities and pressures. They were tasked not only with representing the interests of their constituents, but also with navigating legislative environments often dominated by hostile officials and resistant local populations. They advocated for policies that sought to improve education, protect civil rights, and secure economic opportunities for their communities, efforts that were frequently met with obstruction or sabotage. The significance of their work, however, extended beyond individual legislative victories. It demonstrated to the nation and to their communities that African Americans could govern, legislate, and influence public life with competence and integrity, even when tenure in office was cut short or threatened by violent opposition. The presence of black officials sent a powerful message about the possibilities of a society striving, however imperfectly, toward equality. Voting, as well as holding office, became acts of communal assertion and personal empowerment, fostering a sense of agency that permeated everyday life. For African Americans emerging from generations of enslavement, the act of casting a ballot was laden with symbolic weight, a declaration that they were citizens with a stake in shaping the laws and policies that governed them. Families and communities invested in this process, teaching children about civic responsibility, organizing gatherings to discuss political issues, and offering mutual support to those threatened or attacked for participating in elections. These acts were interwoven with broader strategies of survival and advancement, connecting political engagement to economic stability, educational access, and communal resilience. Voting was not an isolated act, but part of a larger tapestry in which freedom was enacted through collective effort, negotiation, and steadfast determination. The broader society, however, was often resistant to these changes. Southern legislatures and local authorities enacted laws and policies designed to curtail the political influence of African Americans, instituting poll taxes, literacy tests, and other barriers that would later solidify into the Jim Crow system. Despite such opposition, the period of Reconstruction demonstrated a remarkable, if fragile, expansion of black political participation. Communities witnessed their neighbors, friends, and relatives assuming roles as sheriffs, legislators, and local officials, challenging the long-standing perception that governance and public decision-making were exclusive to white citizens. These achievements, while subject to subsequent retrenchment and backlash, established a precedent for civic engagement and leadership that would echo through generations, serving as a foundation for future movements for civil rights and social justice. The experiences of African Americans during Reconstruction reveal the intricate interplay between opportunity, courage, and systemic resistance. Political participation was inseparable from the broader efforts to claim autonomy, build educational institutions, secure economic stability, and protect communal well-being. Each vote cast and each office held represented not only personal agency, but also a collective assertion that freedom entailed responsibility, engagement, and influence. These acts of civic involvement were underpinned by the resilience of communities that had endured generations of oppression, nurtured by the educational and spiritual foundations cultivated in schools and churches, and sustained by networks of mutual support that allowed individuals to confront intimidation, legal obstacles, and social hostility with determination and solidarity. The Reconstruction era, with its fleeting yet significant expansion of African American political power, illuminates the profound ways in which freedom must be exercised to be meaningful. The individuals who voted and held office navigated a complex and often hostile environment, demonstrating that liberty encompasses not only legal status but also the ability to participate fully in civic life, to shape policies, and to assert one's voice in the public sphere. Their courage and perseverance transformed the abstract promise of emancipation into concrete action, inspiring communities to envision and pursue a future in which their rights, contributions, and perspectives were recognized and valued. This period serves as a testament to the enduring commitment of African Americans to claim the full measure of their freedom, asserting dignity, agency, and influence in a society that was still learning, often reluctantly, to accept their equality. In the turbulent years following the Civil War, as African Americans endeavored to claim the freedoms that had long been denied to them, a darker, more insidious resistance emerged from the shadows of the South, threatening to unravel the fragile progress of emancipation and Reconstruction. For every schoolhouse built, for every church that opened its doors, and for every ballot cast by a newly enfranchised black voter, there were forces determined to assert control through fear and violence, to remind freedmen and women that the legacy of slavery and white supremacy had not vanished with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Among the most notorious of these forces was the Ku Klux Klan, a secretive organization whose very presence embodied terror and intimidation, using a combination of threats, assaults, and symbolic displays of power to enforce racial hierarchies and suppress the political, social, and economic rights of African Americans. The Klan and similar groups did not operate randomly. Their actions were calculated and systematic, targeting communities that dared to exercise their legal rights or to challenge the deeply entrenched social order. African Americans who attended school, participated in political meetings, or sought economic independence were often singled out, their homes and churches threatened or attacked to instill fear and enforce compliance. The imagery of terror masked figures on horseback, bonfires blazing with threatening symbols, and the pervasive rumor of imminent violence permeated daily life, a constant reminder that freedom, though granted by law, was fragile in practice. Families who once dared to envision autonomy and security found themselves living under a veil of constant vigilance, adapting their movements, gatherings, and aspirations to avoid provoking the wrath of those determined to maintain control through intimidation. Communities responded with remarkable resilience, using the very institutions they had built, churches, schools, and mutual aid societies, as buffers against the pervasive threat of violence. Clergy and educators became not only spiritual and intellectual guides, but also protectors and strategists, organizing watch systems, coordinating community responses, and teaching strategies for maintaining safety while continuing to pursue education, civic engagement, and economic advancement. Children learned early on that literacy, knowledge, and awareness of rights were tools not merely for personal growth but also for survival, equipping them to navigate the dangerous terrain of a society in which law and custom were often at odds with justice. Families passed down stories, warnings, and strategies, blending oral tradition with practical guidance, cultivating a culture of vigilance, solidarity, and resistance. The impact of such terror was profound, shaping behavior, relationships, and aspirations. African Americans developed intricate networks of communication to warn one another of impending danger, shared resources to mitigate economic vulnerability that could be exploited by aggressors, and adapted cultural practices to maintain cohesion and morale, even as they faced threats to their homes, livelihoods, and lives. These communities persisted, refusing to allow fear to wholly dictate their futures. The churches and schools that had become central to their lives provided both refuge and continuity, offering spaces in which the values of dignity, hope, and agency could be nurtured even under the specter of violence. Social rituals, collective worship, and communal education became acts of defiance, asserting presence and resilience in a world that sought to erase or diminish them. The Klan's terror extended beyond physical assaults to the political and economic spheres, aiming to suppress black participation in governance and limit access to employment and land. Voters were intimidated at the polls, candidates were threatened or attacked, and economic reprisals were common against those who dared to assert independence through land ownership or business. The intertwining of economic control, political disenfranchisement, and social intimidation created a comprehensive system of oppression, designed to preserve a social order in which African Americans remained subordinate despite legal emancipation. Yet, the responses of black communities demonstrated that fear, while formidable, could not extinguish the drive for self-determination. Each act of education, each vote, each public office assumed, and each institution built served as a countermeasure, a tangible manifestation of resilience that both challenged and endured the forces arrayed against it. The terror wielded by the Ku Klux Klan also catalyzed broader political and social reactions, highlighting the limitations of local enforcement and the necessity of federal intervention during Reconstruction. Freedmen appealed to the Freedmen's Bureau, federal troops, and sympathetic lawmakers, seeking protection and justice, and in doing so, asserted the principle that freedom entailed more than the absence of legal chains. It required active safeguarding of rights and the capacity to participate fully in civic and communal life. These struggles underscored a central paradox of the era. While emancipation offered legal liberty, the practical exercise of freedom depended on continuous vigilance, collective organization, and the courage to confront entrenched opposition. Communities learned to balance bold engagement with strategic caution, maintaining momentum in education, political participation, and economic endeavor while mitigating risks from those who sought to restore the pre-war racial hierarchy. In recounting this period, it becomes evident that the existence of terror did not nullify progress, but rather framed it within a context of extraordinary resilience. African Americans navigated the persistent threats posed by the Ku Klux Klan and allied groups through ingenuity, solidarity, and determination, transforming fear into a motivating force that reinforced communal bonds and sharpened strategic thinking. The churches and schools that had taken root became not only centers of growth and learning, but also fortresses of protection and coordination, demonstrating that collective agency could withstand intimidation. Every classroom session, community meeting, and act of worship was imbued with significance, serving simultaneously as education, spiritual sustenance, and affirmation of presence and rights in a society structured to deny them. The era of Reconstruction, with its brief expansion of political and social rights for African Americans, was shadowed by the persistent, deliberate threat of violence, a reality embodied by the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. Yet, in the face of terror, African American communities demonstrated remarkable fortitude, leveraging education, faith, and mutual aid to protect themselves, advance their interests, and lay the groundwork for long-term social, economic, and political empowerment. Their story reveals the duality of freedom in this era, a legal status fraught with practical dangers, yet simultaneously a catalyst for resilience, ingenuity, and enduring hope, illustrating that the quest for equality required not only the exercise of rights, but also the courage to confront and survive the forces determined to suppress them. As the optimism of Reconstruction waned and federal oversight receded from the South in the late 19th century, African Americans who had once tasted the possibilities of political participation, education, and economic independence found themselves confronted with a new, insidious set of barriers designed to curtail the freedoms they had fought so hard to attain. The legal landscape shifted dramatically, codifying racial hierarchies into what would become known as Jim Crow laws, a system that entrenched segregation and restricted civil rights, erasing many of the gains achieved during the turbulent years immediately following emancipation. Streets, schools, transportation, and public facilities were divided along color lines, with the law enforcing distinctions that permeated every aspect of daily life, and every interaction underscored the reality that freedom in law did not necessarily translate into equality in practice. For African Americans, the promise of emancipation now existed alongside the harsh reality of legally sanctioned discrimination, a tension that shaped communities, ambitions, and strategies for survival and advancement in profound ways. These laws, often framed under the guise of separate but equal, were anything but equitable. In practice, they institutionalized second-class citizenship, relegating black people to underfunded schools, limited access to public services, and inferior accommodations. Communities that had poured energy into establishing schools, churches, and local governance now had to contend with restrictions that threatened to undermine these institutions' effectiveness. The vibrant networks of support, education, and social cohesion that had sustained black communities during Reconstruction became critical lifelines in the Jim Crow era, providing resources, knowledge, and resilience in a society that actively sought to limit both mobility and opportunity. Families relied heavily on one another, pooling scarce resources to maintain schools, support local leaders, and preserve traditions, ensuring that children could still access education and cultural knowledge despite the systemic obstacles erected by state and local governments. Economic life was similarly circumscribed. African Americans were often denied access to competitive employment opportunities, land ownership, and fair wages, pushing many back into cycles of tenancy and labor exploitation that closely resembled the hardships of slavery. Sharecropping and tenant farming remained prevalent, and with discriminatory practices embedded into contracts. Law enforcement and local economies, financial independence was elusive for many families. Despite these challenges, communities cultivated resilience and ingenuity, establishing cooperative systems, small businesses, and informal networks of mutual aid to sustain themselves and create pathways for incremental progress. The ability to navigate this oppressive framework required not only labor and resourcefulness, but also careful strategy, knowledge of the law, and collective effort, transforming the act of survival into a complex, ongoing negotiation with the structures of power. Education, which had been a cornerstone of empowerment during Reconstruction, became a contested battleground under Jim Crow. Schools for black children were chronically underfunded, overcrowded, and staffed with fewer resources, yet the determination of families and communities remained unshaken. Churches, community centers, and informal learning circles became vital extensions of formal education, teaching not only literacy and numeracy but also civic knowledge, cultural history, and strategies for navigating a society designed to impose limitations. The act of learning itself became an act of defiance, a statement that despite legal restrictions and social prejudice, African Americans would continue to cultivate knowledge, self-determination, and the tools necessary to protect their families and assert their rights within the confines of a segregated system. Political engagement, too, was curtailed under Jim Crow, as literacy tests, poll taxes, and other discriminatory measures effectively disenfranchised black voters in many states. Those who had previously held public office during Reconstruction were gradually removed from power, and the capacity for communities to influence legislation and protect civil rights diminished. Yet, even as formal avenues of political participation were restricted, African Americans continued to organize at the local level, forming associations, mutual aid societies, and advocacy groups to preserve autonomy, educate their communities, and push for incremental change. The political struggle became intertwined with social and economic strategies, as community leaders leveraged every available resource to maintain cohesion, protect families, and foster a sense of dignity and agency in a society that systematically sought to diminish them. Social life under legalized segregation was similarly constrained. Public spaces, transportation, and recreational facilities were divided, signaling constantly the hierarchy imposed by law. The psychological and emotional toll of these daily reminders of inequality was profound. Yet African American communities adapted through the creation of alternative spaces where culture, faith, and social bonds could thrive. Churches became not just spiritual centers but hubs of cultural expression. Civic organization and education. While schools, community halls, and informal networks provided forums for dialogue, mentorship, and mutual support, music, storytelling, and oral tradition flourished, carrying lessons, history, and identity across generations in a society that attempted to suppress these expressions of humanity. The legal codification of racial segregation and limitation of civil rights transformed the context of freedom into one of persistent negotiation and resilience. African Americans had to navigate a society in which every aspect of public life, from schooling to employment, voting to travel, was mediated through the lens of discriminatory laws designed to uphold inequality. Yet within these constraints, communities demonstrated remarkable creativity and determination, finding ways to educate children, organize socially, build economic foundations, and maintain dignity. The interplay of law, custom, and community resilience defined the era, illustrating that while legal emancipation had been achieved, the work of transforming freedom into genuine opportunity and equality required continual effort, ingenuity, and solidarity. In reflecting on this period, it is clear that the late 19th century, marked by legalized segregation and curtailed civil rights, posed profound challenges but also revealed the enduring strength of African American communities. Through education, faith, communal networks, and careful negotiation of economic and social realities, families preserved culture, nurtured knowledge, and sustained hope in the face of systemic oppression. The story of this era is one of resilience under constraint, of communities leveraging the resources they could access to claim dignity, cultivate opportunity, and prepare future generations to continue the struggle for full equality. Segregation may have been enshrined in law, but the determination of African Americans to assert agency, preserve identity, and pursue justice persisted, laying the groundwork for the long arc of progress that would extend well into the 20th century and beyond, demonstrating that even in the face of legalized injustice, the human spirit could find ways to endure, adapt, and aspire. In the decades following emancipation, African American families confronted a harsh and unyielding economic reality that often belied the promise of freedom, as systemic barriers limited access to land, employment, and capital, trapping many in persistent cycles of poverty and dependency. Though slavery had been abolished and legal freedom was nominally guaranteed, the structures of economic oppression evolved rather than disappeared, taking forms that restricted mobility, opportunity, and autonomy. Land ownership, long recognized as a cornerstone of economic independence and security, remained largely out of reach for black families. White landowners, economic elites, and local governments implemented practices and policies that ensured land remained concentrated in the hands of those who had previously wielded power, offering black laborers only marginal plots under sharecropping or tenant farming arrangements that were designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal benefit. In these arrangements, the promise of independence was frequently undermined by exploitative contracts, inflated supply costs, and arbitrary assessments of debt, creating a cycle in which laborers found themselves perpetually indebted to the very landowners they worked for. A system that mirrored the dependency of slavery under a veneer of legality. Employment opportunities outside of agriculture were similarly constrained, as racial discrimination pervaded nearly every sector of the economy. Black workers were often relegated to the most menial, poorly paid, and unstable positions, while opportunities for skilled labor, apprenticeships, or business ownership were limited by both formal regulations and informal social pressures. Even when individuals possessed education, experience, or entrepreneurial acumen, access to capital and credit was scarce, making it difficult to start businesses, acquire tools, or invest in property. Banks, lenders, and local authorities frequently discriminated against black applicants, denying loans or imposing onerous conditions that effectively prevented upward mobility. In rural areas, families depended on cash advances from merchants or landowners, which came at high interest rates and often resulted in cycles of debt that spanned generations. Urban areas offered some alternative work, but these opportunities were highly competitive, poorly regulated, and subject to systemic exclusion and prejudice, reinforcing the concentration of poverty among those without access to inherited wealth or social networks connected to opportunity. The interconnection of limited land, scarce jobs, and restricted access to capital created a pervasive environment of insecurity, where survival often demanded extraordinary resourcefulness. Families relied on mutual aid networks, pooling labor, tools, and knowledge to sustain their households and communities, while churches and schools became crucial hubs for sharing information, coordinating support, and fostering resilience. Within these spaces, African Americans developed strategies to navigate exploitative labor arrangements, teach financial literacy, and cultivate skills that might offer incremental advancement. Education was leveraged not merely as an abstract aspiration but as a pragmatic tool to challenge economic constraints, enabling children and adults to understand contracts, manage accounts, and develop skills that could increase their bargaining power and reduce vulnerability to exploitation. Even under restrictive social conditions, communities nurtured cultural and intellectual capital, understanding that knowledge and solidarity could serve as protective mechanisms against the structural forces that kept them economically marginalized. Economic deprivation was closely tied to social and political marginalization, creating a feedback loop that reinforced inequality. Without land, stable employment, or access to credit, African Americans were limited in their ability to exercise political power, engage in community-building projects, or accumulate the resources necessary to sustain educational institutions and cultural centers. Segregation laws and social customs compounded these limitations, ensuring that black families remained confined to specific neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces, which restricted economic networking and reinforced systemic inequities. Despite these challenges, communities found ways to assert agency and maintain cohesion, developing cooperative enterprises, informal lending systems, and collective labor arrangements that mitigated the harshest effects of economic exclusion. These efforts demonstrated remarkable ingenuity, transforming adversity into a framework for resilience, even as the overarching structures of oppression continued to constrain long-term prosperity. The psychological and emotional toll of sustained poverty was profound, shaping the expectations, ambitions, and daily experiences of families who had been promised freedom but confronted an environment of systemic limitation. Parents worked tirelessly to provide for their children, instilling values of education, perseverance, and community solidarity, even when the resources available were insufficient to meet basic needs. Children learned early on the importance of adaptability, labor, and mutual support, absorbing lessons about the economic structures that constrained their opportunities and the strategies necessary to navigate them. Within this context, cultural practices, oral history, music, and religious observance became critical mechanisms for maintaining hope, identity, and dignity, providing a counterbalance to the hardships imposed by structural poverty. Community rituals, shared labor, and collective celebrations reinforced cohesion and transmitted knowledge, allowing families to maintain a sense of agency and continuity even amid persistent material scarcity. Generational cycles of poverty, rooted in restricted access to land, jobs, and capital, were not simply economic phenomena. They reflected the broader social architecture of post-emancipation America, in which freedom existed alongside systemic exclusion and inequality. Yet the lived experience of African American communities during this period reveals an enduring capacity for adaptation, resilience, and creativity. Families cultivated strategies to maximize limited resources, protect one another, and create opportunities where formal structures offered none, demonstrating that economic constraint did not preclude agency or aspiration. Every small achievement, paying off a debt, securing a plot of land, sending a child to school, starting a small enterprise, represented a meaningful assertion of autonomy and hope, an incremental step toward breaking the cycle of poverty and building a foundation for future generations. The story of African American families navigating post-emancipation economic realities illustrates the complexity of freedom in a society still shaped by racial hierarchies and structural exclusion. Legal liberation alone was insufficient to guarantee prosperity or equality. Without access to land, employment, and capital, many were forced to contend with the lingering legacies of slavery and systemic discrimination. Yet the ingenuity, perseverance, and solidarity of these communities transformed scarcity into opportunity, forging networks of mutual support, cultivating knowledge, and asserting dignity in the face of systemic barriers. Their experience underscores a central truth. True freedom encompasses not only legal status but the tangible ability to exercise agency, pursue economic stability, and nurture future generations, and even in the most constrained circumstances. African American families demonstrated a profound capacity to navigate adversity and lay the groundwork for enduring resilience and progress. As we reflect on the long and often painful journey of African American communities in the years following emancipation, one truth becomes abundantly clear. Despite relentless oppression, systemic exclusion, and the daily realities of fear and poverty, Black communities persisted with remarkable resilience, vision, and courage. They faced a society that consistently sought to limit their opportunities, curtail their freedoms, and erase their voices. Yet they responded not with resignation but with creativity, solidarity, and determination. Across the South and beyond, families, neighbors, and local leaders worked tirelessly to build institutions that could serve as pillars of support, education, and empowerment. Churches and schools became more than mere buildings. They became sanctuaries where knowledge, faith, and community converged, nurturing generations to assert their humanity, claim their rights, and dream of a better future. These institutions carried the weight of both necessity and aspiration. Churches, with their dual roles as spiritual centers and hubs of community organization, provided guidance, protection, and advocacy in a society often hostile to Black progress. They were places where sermons inspired courage, where leaders coordinated responses to threats, and where families could gather safely to exchange knowledge, strategize, and reinforce cultural identity. Schools, though chronically underfunded and overcrowded under segregationist policies, were beacons of hope and transformation. Teaching literacy, numeracy, history, and civic awareness, equipping students with tools to navigate oppressive economic and legal systems. These educational spaces were revolutionary, not merely for the content they imparted, but for the statement they made. Knowledge is power, and the mind cannot be enslaved. Generations who learned within these walls carried forward the capacity to resist exploitation, advocate for rights, and cultivate leadership that would resonate for decades to come. Economic resilience was equally vital to the survival and advancement of Black communities. Even when denied access to land, fair employment, or capital, families devised innovative ways to sustain themselves and create opportunities. Mutual aid networks, cooperative ventures, and informal support systems allowed communities to weather cycles of poverty and debt, to educate children, and to maintain cultural and social continuity. Small businesses, local artisans, and community farming initiatives became tools of self-reliance, demonstrating that even in the face of systemic barriers, agency could be exercised, autonomy could be carved out, and dignity could be maintained. These economic strategies were not merely practical, they were acts of resistance, a refusal to allow structural oppression to define the limits of possibility. Political engagement, despite formidable obstacles, remained a crucial arena for asserting rights and agency. African Americans fought tirelessly to vote, to hold office, and to influence policies that affected their lives, often in the face of intimidation, violence, and legal maneuvering designed to suppress their voices. Every ballot cast, every public office assumed, and every organized protest was a testament to resilience and determination, affirming that freedom was more than a legal designation, it was an active, ongoing pursuit. Even when legal frameworks were stacked against them and Jim Crow laws sought to nullify gains made during Reconstruction, the courage of Black voters and leaders provided a foundation upon which future civil rights movements could build, demonstrating that persistence in the face of oppression can lay the groundwork for transformative change. Cultural preservation and community solidarity were equally powerful forces in sustaining hope and identity. Music, storytelling, religious rituals, and oral history allowed communities to maintain connection with their heritage while navigating a society that sought to marginalize them. These traditions offered solace, continuity, and a framework for teaching younger generations the lessons of endurance, morality, and resistance. Within neighborhoods and family networks, knowledge, strategies, and values were transmitted from one generation to the next, ensuring that even under the weight of systemic oppression, African Americans could retain a sense of self, purpose, and communal pride. This cultural resilience, intertwined with educational, economic, and political efforts, created a multi-dimensional approach to survival and empowerment that was both adaptive and visionary. The story of African American perseverance after emancipation illustrates a profound truth about the human spirit. That resilience is not merely the endurance of hardship, but the capacity to transform adversity into opportunity, to create institutions where none existed, and to assert agency in every possible sphere of life, by building schools, churches, mutual aid networks, and businesses, and by fighting for justice through voting, legal challenges, and civic organization. Black communities demonstrated an unwavering commitment to their own dignity and to the collective progress of their people. This persistence not only sustained individuals and families in the face of oppression, but also laid the foundation for broader social movements that would eventually reshape American society. In honoring this legacy, we recognize that the struggle for freedom and equality is both historical and ongoing. The achievements of those who persevered through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and systemic economic exclusion are reminders that resilience, solidarity, and vision can overcome even the most entrenched forms of oppression. Each institution built, each vote, each act of cultural preservation contributes to a continuing story of courage, resourcefulness, and hope. By learning from their experiences, we are reminded that freedom and justice are not merely abstract ideals, they are lived, enacted, and defended through the tireless efforts of individuals and communities committed to a better, more equitable world. Thank you for taking the time to follow this journey through history. If you found this story inspiring or informative, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who are interested in learning about the resilience and strength of Black communities throughout history. Your support helps keep these stories alive and accessible to more people. Now, from all of us, we wish you a restful and peaceful night. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with hope, courage, and inspiration.